Hello everyone, welcome to Idea Roastery. I'm Jason.
And I'm Herman.
So Herman, have you been feeling the pinch recently?
Which kind of pinch?
There's a thing called the cost of living crisis, which is going on at least in the UK. Have you noticed like a increase in costs of things, maybe in South Africa or just globally?
Yeah, it's actually been a fairly interesting one because our inflation rate in South Africa is actually fairly low for South Africa, yet everyone is talking about how the cost of living has increased, and everyone tends to be pointing fingers at the government for exaggerating how low the inflation rate actually is. Personally, I haven't noticed it that much, but I also live in a particularly expensive part of the city and the country in general, so everything's just expensive over here for South Africa.
But have you noticed anything over, like the last year or two, or I mean, because you've been living in Cape Town for quite a while now, so like obviously compared to, I mean, if you take like coffee price for instance.
Coffee price has, but I think it's because the coffee over here is now like fancy single origin, roasted by a man with caffeine symbols tattooed all the way up his arms. I can't really speak to the price of a regular cup of coffee, but the cost of accommodation and rent has definitely gone up significantly in certain parts of the city, that in a very impressive way. And I guess, you know, it comes down to I forget what the exact term is, the everything crisis always comes down to housing, because if the cost of housing goes up, then it necessitates the increase in everything else.
Yeah. So the reason I wanted to bring it up is because I was reading a report by one of the big consulting companies, and this report, I guess, is tailored towards people who are hiring both millennials and Gen Z. So I saw a couple of articles on Hacker News and a few people tweeting about it, that apparently the Gen Z and millennials are unable to maintain jobs. And in this specific survey, they actually pointed to the fact that there's like been a huge jump in financial insecurity amongst Gen Z and millennials, and it's jumped basically from 2024 to 2025 from 32% to 46%, where people are feeling financially insecure. The question is, do you think this is actually a cost of living thing where or life is getting harder, or do you think it is that we are becoming unable to cope with life?
It's an interesting toss-up between perception and reality, and this is sort of a common theme that we talk about, because let's take for instance, the perception is that the world is always getting worse, whereas the reality is that the world is pretty much always getting better. I definitely err on the side of, like, yes, cost of living goes through bumps, and this we could have a increase in the cost of living right now, but to be entirely honest, I do think that a lot of it comes down to perception. I think that millennials and Gen Z are told every day on, you know, social media and YouTube that the cost of living is going up, so you should feel financially insecure, and so they do. I think the common one is the whole cost of, again, the housing everything crisis, is that salary hasn't kept pace with the cost of property, and so people are less likely to be able to afford accommodation in the same way that their parents or great-grandparents could. There are certain caveats to it, and I think the reason why it's a good discussion topic is that there's a lot of nuance to it. But if I were to summarize my perception over here, I think that we are actually in a much more abundant state than at any point before in history. But there is a problem in that we have rampant access to very cheap and easy credit, and I think that has put a whole bunch of young people into very financially precarious situations, because at least historically you couldn't get a, you know, buy now pay later account or a credit card right out of university and go into 100,000 rands worth of debt, whereas currently you can very easily.
Do you think that millennials have had a bad bargain? Because I feel like for our generation, we grew up in a time that was really quite fun. Like we had like games and the birth of computers, and I think it was a whole sort of abundance era that came out of that. Um, then we got like hit with like the global financial crisis, and then there was like a couple of sort of, I mean, at least in the UK, was austerity, which I think kind of like went around the world, where everyone was like, oh no, we got to tighten our belts. There's like all this like, financial stuff that someone fucked up somewhere, and now we have to bail out all these things. And I think ever since then, it feels like there's been like a lull in at least in the economies of like, and obviously like a lot of the global economy is linked to like these major economies like the US and the UK and Japan and those kind of things. Then we had like COVID, and so now we're getting to like we're like sort of 30s, 35s, and like we've kind of had like a really shitty ride since we left childhood. Do you think it's just like that we're in a bad place, that we've just like unlucky that we were born at that time where we've gone through these negative sort of cycles, and maybe that's what's making festering, I guess, like a feeling of like despair about what's going to happen? Because I think a lot of us, like, we went to university, we got our degrees, and now we got a job, and now it's like getting to a point where like, oh, I'm like early 30s, mid 35s, like is it paying off? And maybe there's that trade-off that we're thinking about. Do you think we just had a bad break, or is there something else there?
So actually, no. I think that this all comes down to perception. This has been termed by like social psychologists as the vibe session. Is that according to data collected globally, but more specifically in the United States, millennials are set to become the wealthiest generation in history, and as Gen Zs, grow up and whatnot, they are actually also set to become the wealthiest generation in history. And I think that this vibe session, one of the key characteristics, and this is shown through many social psychology studies, is that people's life satisfaction, their financial satisfaction, is predicated on comparison to the people around them, right? Now, throughout all of human history, the people around you literally meant the people around you. You were comparing your lifestyles to everyone else within, a 10-kilometer radius. Whereas now with social media and YouTube and all these platforms as they are, as you're connected into this broader global market, is that you can be living a fairly austere student lifestyle, and you go onto Instagram every day and you're following a bunch of influencers who are, throwing $100 bills out the window of their Ferrari. And that you think, okay, how much does a Ferrari cost? Okay, it's $1 million. $1 million. If I were to try and save $1 million at my current job, that'll take me my entire working career. And so this was very well summarized in I don't know if this was a study or an informal survey, but it asked different generations what is considered to be well off to you, like financially secure to you. And the boomers said something along the lines of $40,000 per year, $50,000 per year. With millennials, it went up to something like $70,000 per year. And then with Gen Z, it went up to $400,000 per year. And so it kind of is predicated on this feeling of, if you aren't matching the lifestyles of the people who you see online on these platforms, which in a lot of cases falsified, right? It's a rented Lamborghini, it's a rented mansion that they're using to film some content. If you're not matched to that, then you're not well off. And so I do think that the vibe session is exactly that. It's based on vibes, while we're at the point in history that is actually incredibly favorable to the youngest generations.
Yeah, I think I'd actually add to that because the thing I was thinking about in coming up with this topic is also that even the so you're talking about the positive like influences. You're like, look at what I've got, like, but I think there's also this thread of almost like I guess like unprepared content where people are like they're just like a doctor. I've seen it specifically in the UK where like obviously the NHS is under a lot of strain, whether that's like a perception thing or not. But they have these like people on TikTok who are just like a doctor and they're talking about how bad their like job is and how stressed they are and how burnt out they feel. And I feel that that kind of content also adds to that where it's almost like it's giving you permission to notice these things. Obviously, there are tough jobs in the world, and there are obviously people who are like probably not making a sustainable amount, especially in government work, for instance, which is known to be well underpaid. But I think it also opens up the door for other people to think about, oh well, maybe I've got this negative thing that's in my work, and maybe that's also adding to their negativity.
Yeah, I think that you're entirely onto something over there. Is that if we're also there's both the comparative lifestyle, and then there's definitely like if you hear from everyone that things are worse, then like you're going to believe it yourself.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think it's like it's kind of like I read up about memetics. It's where you have this like unconscious sort of copying of other people. So if someone else is like going to university or doing a certain thing like getting into paddle, suddenly you've got like this urge to like go and get into paddle or do these things, right? So I think it like enhances like something that's within us, which is like these different biases that bias us into different directions. So I guess it kind of like points to the whole like social media being pretty negative. But what do you say to people who say that, oh well, our parents could afford houses and now we're like in our mid 30s and we can't even afford a house?
So that's actually a really interesting one. And like people aren't swayed by numbers or stats, they're swayed by emotional stories, because humans, we love stories, right? So, for example, when I was in university, which isn't that long ago, it's 10 years ago, my spending money for the entire month was 1,000 rand, right? Which works out to, let's call it like $70. Like students right now can easily go and blow $70 on one night out of sushi, right? But that wasn't even on the table for me. However, I never felt poor at the time. I didn't, because no one was telling me I was poor, or like no one was showing me what I was supposed to be doing in university was going for sushi all the time, right? Instead, we just like were just some some nasty students buying cheap alcohol and getting drunk in public parks, right? And so like that's the one characteristic, is like that over there is a story, and it is prescriptive of the time. But when I say things don't necessarily, when actual stats don't necessarily convince people, is like if I were to tell you, and this is true, for a given age of a person, millennials have a higher home ownership rate than boomers did at that same age, and that stat goes up with Gen Z, which means like if the number of, or the percentage of 30-year-olds who own their home, millennials is more than the boomers, and for Gen Z is more than millennials, although Gen Z hasn't gotten to 30 yet, so let's call it 2024. And so yes, things were houses were cheaper back in the day. However, the actual ownership of homes per a given age range is higher currently than it was historically, which sort of suggests that you can that it is affordable. Not affordable, but like it can be afforded.
Mm. So you touched on something there. Like, you thinking that the tastes have evolved? So previously we would have been fine to just go to a gig and sort of get drunk on like cheap booze, and now people are like, oh, you only really made it if you're able to go on a holiday and like stay in an Airbnb, because I've also been thinking about this too, because I was thinking like, oh, when I was a kid, like what did we do for like holidays, because we didn't really have that much like cash. So it was like you went, like you drove somewhere, or you went somewhere
You
and
went
you stayed
camping.
in like, yeah, you went camping. So I do think that there is also like a sort of change in people's tastes in what is perceived, and maybe this is also social media driven, or just people's expectation is like, when you go on holiday, you don't just stay in a hotel anymore. You rent a whole apartment, which is obviously a sort of more expensive endeavor. Do you think the tastes are change, or do you think that there's actually less stuff available at that lower price point for people to do?
Yeah, it definitely has changed, and that's why it's actually difficult to do these comparisons. So, for example, the average size of a house has dramatically increased. Like the floor space of the house has increased over the last 50 years by a lot, right? And so when we say like, oh, people can't afford homes right now, they're also talking about a house that is significantly larger. Also, certain things are definitely cheaper, and that's undeniable, right? It's like, I mean, certain things weren't even available, like the internet and streaming media and electronic devices, etc., etc. And so we don't really have something to compare that to. I actually think what's a big driver of this is that we just have more things to spend our money on. Is that if you were equally wealthy in 1970 and today, but you only spent money on things that were available in 1970 today, you'd have so much more purchasing power, because the things that you spend your money on would be cheaper, and you're also not spending your money on a Netflix subscription and uh, $5 cup of coffee at the local roastery. And so I think that we have a really good deal, but we also have a really bad deal, in that there are just so many things to spend money on, and there's also a social expectation to spend money on those things. And we're kind of told that, hey, you're not doing okay if you don't spend money on those things, if you can't spend money on those things. I mean, like what you brought up with the vacations, right? Our generation is the first generation where traveling internationally isn't like a once in a lifetime thing. Like boomers and older, they talk about like the one trip that they took to France, and it was the life-changing experience. And now, uh, middle class millennials and Gen Z travel once a year internationally.
I guess it's both. Like there has been a reduction in costs as well, but I think that cost was maybe momentarily because, or it was for a brief period, because obviously with carbon taxes and stuff, it's like also increased the price again. And obviously during COVID, there was a huge sort of fluctuation in prices. But yeah, I think there is a degree of that. But I also wonder if, because I've also noticed that there's been a couple of articles about venues closing down in the UK and just across the world. People aren't really going to pubs anymore. Do you think like people have just recluded themselves from these like things? Because I'm like thinking, when last did I actually go to a gig or like a live music thing? And I'm like thinking there's not really that many around that I'm aware of. Maybe it's my awareness of these things is not there. But I remember like going, you just go down to a pub and you watch someone play live music, and that was like a thing to do. But maybe people are they too lazy? Is it just that like now it's turned into YouTube, or like what is? Has there been a lack of societal things? Right? Is there less to do?
Well, for fear of having this entire thing be about the modern content platforms, is that if let's say for instance you're in the 90s, which or early 2000s, which we were, and it's a Tuesday evening and you're bored, well, you have to go and find something to do, right? Like, there's only so many television channels, and most of them were playing junk. You've you've taken a look at all the books that you own and you've read them all, or you're not particularly interested. So your friend says, hey, we're going to this gig. Of course you're going to go to the gig, right? What else are you going to do? Sit at home and look at the wall. Whereas right now we are in a entertainment abundance, right? Which has its own negative consequences, is that you don't even need a TV or anything like that. You can just have your phone and you can be, I don't want to say content because content isn't the right word, but you can be entertained enough that prevents you from going and making plans to go and do something interesting, right? It's like a drip of just enough entertainment that, like, actually, yeah, you're not looking for a gig, you're not looking for anything to do, you're instead going to, watch YouTube videos on your phone for the evening. And that's entirely possible. And it's also cheaper. Like, watching YouTube videos is a lot cheaper than going to a gig where you might buy a couple of drinks, pay the entrance fee, And so while I do think it is unfortunate, it does also make sense, is like entertaining yourself. Do you remember like being a kid and actually having nothing to do, right? Like being so bored and you're like, I need to find something to do. So you have to like go through all the things that you are in the house again just to see if there's anything to do.
Yeah.
Whereas like, that's just not a thing now. There's always more content for you to consume.
Yeah, I'd get on my bike and just ride around the block.
Yeah, exactly.
Or my parents would say, just go ride around the block and do something.
Yeah.
But I guess maybe they are linked in a bit in a way, because I think also, especially here in London, like things are expensive. Like just to go out and buy a round of drinks is a lot. So maybe it's expensive because it's not that popular anymore. Like, because now if you think of a pub that has to sort of pay their rent and they have to pay their staff, it's quite a heavy overlay, especially if you're moving the pub all the way up until like 2 o'clock in the morning. But that has to be sort of balanced by your number of customers, and if there's less customers, maybe that's also leading to a heavier price. But do you think there's any thread of like, I guess obviously, yeah, do you think there's any thread of like maybe it is just the world getting more expensive, or do you think it's just more of a mindset thing that we need to sort of settle on?
Like, I can't say that the world isn't. I can't say that the world isn't getting more expensive. I think in certain ways it is, and in certain ways it isn't. And in certain ways we can't actually compare. For example, technology, right? We can't compare that because it didn't exist. Whereas in certain ways we do know that things are more expensive, like the cost of tertiary education is a lot more expensive. The cost of a house, maybe not necessarily the floor space of the house, but the house is more expensive. However, what I can say is that the perception has gotten dramatically worse over time. And I think that this is just a part of being a hyper-connected, content-consuming society. So have things actually gotten more expensive? Maybe, maybe not. Has the perception of things gotten worse? Absolutely. What do you think?
This goes into what I was wanting to talk about next, which is the, I guess, solutions or the ways to try and combat it. So whether it is getting expensive or not, I think there is a part to play in your perception. So I think there is part of both sides where it's like it is getting more expensive, but people need to be sort of equipped with a better way of seeing the world in order to make sure that they are not going to get into sort of a negative spiral and become sort of despondent, because it's hard to deny that those figures of people feeling more financially insecure, even though, technically wealth has gone up, that is like, I feel something that's can be contributed to like the way people perceive. A couple of the ones that I've sort of started to look at as ways, because I've also been through like burnout and these kind of things, and I've also had these feelings of maybe I'm not like getting like on top of the world in a sense, and that is like going through things like the old traditions of like not necessarily religion, but like things like philosophy, stoicism, reading like old kind of like books and stuff where they have a lot of these morals which can help you to at least contextualize yourself in the world a little bit better. So handling things like uncertainty, like how to perceive the world, whether you think the world is like against you or whether you're just saying, okay, well, it's just as it is. I found that has helped me a lot to start a sort of like step away from that. And then obviously to remove yourself from like social media and those kind of things. But I don't know if you have any techniques that you use. Obviously, you don't necessarily feel that because you're not influenced by social media. But what would you say is some of your sort of recommendations on people to sort of get away from this feeling if they have it in the first place?
My recommendations, and this is to sort of treat this feeling, but I think is also just like a really wholesome way to live. And I know like not everyone will take my advice over here, but is just to stop consuming that content, right? Like we did a whole episode on news and progress perception, and this is similar to that. Is that the kinds of content that propagate on these platforms are the ones that have the strongest emotive emotion creating effects. And so, you know, if we were to be watching a TikTok or a YouTube video where the guy was like, yeah, things are fine, you know, it's not going to get much engagement, so it's not going to be shown to many eyeballs. And so I do actually think that one way to sort of treat this is, hey, like maybe don't be on too many social media and content platforms.
So what do you replace that with, though? What do you suggest that people do instead?
Well, as your mom said back in the 2000s, is get on your bike and ride around the block. I mean, I'm actually a proponent for like letting yourself get a little bit bored, and you'll find something to do, right? Whether you go and take a walk, whether you get into a gym routine, whether you start writing, whether you pick up a hobby or a craft, whether you go and learn how to swim good or whatever. There's such a wealth of opportunities for things to do. The problem is that it's competing against a very, very low activation energy drip of content. Is like, why would I go and learn how to sew when I can just watch sewing videos on YouTube? Why would I learn how to swim better when I could just entertain myself? I think that's kind of the premise of the book, entertaining ourselves to death. And it's like, yeah, because we're just on this constant drip, it's easy to not go and do those other things.
And what about social interaction? Because we've spoken about like being the people are less social and people feel more alone these days. How do you confront people who are maybe in that state? Because I guess it kind of feels like a two-way street, right? It's like, okay, I can not be on social media and I can be like trying to go out, but if everyone else is on it, maybe they've also got this negativity. Maybe is it like a dying breed of people who are just, you know, out and about?
No, I actually meet a lot of people who are explicitly trying to forge connections because they've become so disenfranchised with how the world has become antisocial. And so, like, if you go and you look for these people, you will find other people who are looking for it as well. This I can guarantee you. I've met so many people over the last 2 years who have been like, hey, listen, it was a bit of a rough time, especially around 2020, but like I'm out here looking for proper IRL connections. And you know what? They're finding them.
I think that's true, because I think there's also like a micro trend of people, especially the Gen Z, seem to have cottoned onto this, where there's like an anti like social media, anti sort of, I guess, anti work mindset. It's kind of bundled together. So I think there is people that are starting to cotton on. I guess for our generation, whether it's like we've just caught it in time versus like getting to a point where you've maybe got like kids and families and stuff where you don't have that ability to like go and like capture that. Maybe that's to be seen, but I think there is a trend there, and I think that's maybe something to be optimistic about, is that I feel like the world has maybe gone through a really rough part right now, but there's almost like a sort of light at the end of the tunnel to kind of get a little bit better.
I agree with you over there. I think while it may not always seem like it, this was actually put very well by Steven Pinker. Says the reason why we tend to fail to notice progress is because it happens very slowly, whereas calamities happen very fast. So if progress only happens at 1% per year, we don't even notice. But if there's a calamity, there's a 10% drop in 1 year, then we notice and it makes big news. But actually that compounding over time is significantly more powerful.